Welcome back to Alyssa's Movie Takes. Today, I'm going to be joined by my friend, Joseph Holmes. Joseph is an award-nominated filmmaker and culture critic living in New York City, a fellow fan of The Chosen, and he would probably win the award for most faith-based movies ever viewed by one person, though I might be in the running for a close second. And he's co-host of the podcast, The Overthinkers, which you can find here on YouTube or any podcast platform. And we are going to be looking at a disturbing trend we've noticed where the female protagonist dies at the end of the movie. We especially began to notice this in movies that deal with the topic of sexual assault. So, spoiler alert, if we discuss a movie here today, the ending is most likely the women don't make it to the end of the film. Yeah. Joseph, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I remember we having these conversations on our off time, and so I was really glad, excited to come on to talk about with you on the air, talk about this obviously uplifting topic of uplifting movies. For the YouTube audience.
Yeah. So I just want to give you a little bit of background, not you, Joseph, but kind of you guys, a background about me and why are we diving into this topic? Yeah. So I am a healed and restored sexual assault survivor, and I use my story as an umbrella for other victims who are still in the rain. I find myself in a narrow category of people who really are fully recovered, fully restored. So during the start of the pandemic, I did a podcast about my testimony of recovery. Joseph, you heard it, and you suggested that I turn that kind of as an inspiration for a fictional story that points toward hope in the aftermath of such a traumatic event. And yep. I read, and I started doing movie research and also writing an outline and a script. And one of the movies that you suggested that I watch was, as research, was Thelma and Louise. I had not seen this. If you told me based on the trailer that this was a movie about sexual assault, I would have been like, really? Yeah. It looks like a female buddy movie.
Yeah, a buddy
what is Thelma and Louise about, Joseph?
So yeah, the movie is about two women who are good friends who decide to go on a road trip together to get away from their jobs and their relationships that are kind of it's sort of like midlife crisis movie for two women. That's how it sort of presents itself and starts out. But then it goes horribly wrong when, and again, this is not too much of a spoiler because it's like in the first act of the movie. One of them, they're at a club and a man attempts to rape one of them, and the other then kills that man, and they go then on the run from the law. And this part is a spoiler, but this is a discussion about these movies. Like, I mean, she warned you already, so your fault. But turns out that the other one, the one who murdered, was sexually assaulted when she was younger, and the police were not helpful in the situation. And so she doesn't have a lot of trust in the law in these situations. And so they go on this whole journey to figure out a way for them to escape with their lives and their freedom after this horrific thing happens. So that's sort of the general gist of Thelma and Louise. It was, it's considered a landmark in feminist cinema. It's one of the first films, if I'm correct, to win an Oscar for a woman to win an Oscar for best screenplay. It was often thought of as the gold standard for films that sort of, pass the Bechdel test. If you've heard of the Bechdel test in Hollywood, which is just if it's a story about two women who talk to each other about something other than a man, and talked about women talking about sex, the way women actually talk about sex. And, so a lot of critics, particularly female film critics and feminist film critics, have used Thelma and Louise as like, this is the way you should write female characters. This is the way, and there's a lot in the movie that's women objectifying men instead of women being the ones objectified. So there's a lot that is, but also it's one of the most famous movies that deals with sexual assault. Although that's not from a female protagonist's point of view. There have been a lot of movies and shows that have dealt with sexual assault sort of typically it's from the male protagonist's point of view. It's sort of like the woman is the girlfriend or the daughter of the male protagonist who then and he goes off in revenge to like kill the guy. So it's like The Searchers or the Clint Eastwood films, like sort of like that. So this is sort of a landmark in feminist cinema and feminist treatment of these topics.
Okay, so here's my other question, because we're talking about how Hollywood kills women. how do Thelma and Louise die at the end of this movie?
Yes. So at the end of
they both die.
They go through. Yes. It's so at the end of the film, they're being hunted by the law, and they've rejected the protests of the main police protagonist that says that I understand why you did what you did, and if you come in and everything will be okay. They don't believe him, and so they're surrounded by all of the cops and all of the police who are after them, because they've basically become Bonnie and Clyde, or I guess Bonnie and Bonnie for the at this point in the movie. And then they decide, rather than be captured by the police, aka the patriarchy, they decide they're going to drive off of the cliff and kill themselves. So they're dead, but at least they're free. They're not being oppressed by the system anymore. So that's the way the movie ends.
Okay, so we'll get into theories later. So I want to just touch on a second movie here. But before we get into our second movie, I have a question for you, since you brought up the male protagonist going after, starting the adventure movie or the thriller,
right,
based on the rape or sometimes the rape and death of a woman. Can you explain to me fridging? The phrase fridging.
Yeah, it is. So fridging is oddly enough a term that's developed within the comic book world and industry. Gail Simone she was a fan who eventually became a comic book writer of DC Comics particularly, but she noticed a pattern starting with when the internet was sort of becoming a thing. So she was able to see this pattern and then post it online. It gained a lot of traction. She noticed a pattern of female characters who would be raped, killed, done harm to in comic book stories in order to further the story of the male protagonist. So the most famous example of this, of course, from the comics is the death of Gwen Stacy, Spider-Man's girlfriend, which was very famous 1970s comic book story. The first time really a female protagonist of a superhero who was actually killed by the villain without the hero being able to save her. And which you saw kind of a version of that in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 with Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone. But that was but then the what is being referenced in fridging is so she wrote a blog post called an essay called Women in Refrigerators, to reference a Green Lantern comic. Kyle Rayner, his girlfriend was he was off in space or something, and then he came back, and a villain had killed his girlfriend, cut her up, and put her in a refrigerator, stuffed her in a refrigerator. And then he comes back, and so you basically have a female character who had been built up as her own character with her own storyline ostensibly. I mean, she's still the love interest character, but she's killed not to further her own story, giving a fitting death to her own character arc, but merely to do things, further a character storyline for the male character. So this happens a lot of times in superhero comics. The male character is their loved one is killed, and so then it causes them to have to wrestle with, do I pursue vengeance or justice, something like that. And so what does that do to the superhero when someone they love dies? How does that further their character, the themes of the story? So she was noticing this pattern that this happened a lot in superhero comic books, and so that became something that was an internet meme. It's okay, this is a problem in superhero comics. Not that this happens in superhero comics, because of course a storyline where the love interest character of a superhero dies, and that is a legitimate story, you can tell. But this had happened so often in a way that was crowding out women actually being able to be characters that were valued in these stories, other than to be dismissed and used to just in a way that just dismissed to the degree they'd be killed, rather than to serve the interest of a male hero, rather than having something to say and being valuable in themselves. So that became that. So fridging became a shorthand term for that dynamic playing out.
Okay. So and I just want to make a distinction here, because what I think I found interesting as I did some of the research on these movies, or started to watch them, is Thelma and Louise, and the one we're going to talk about next, are written by women.
Yes.
So they kind of fall into the feminist lore, but
Yes.
they still die at the end, right?
Yes.
So often in Fridging, you're having the character die at the beginning or somewhere in the middle. These are the character arcs ends with the death of these women. So they end up in feminist lore as like, yes, they're sticking it to the patriarchy. They just don't get to live to see it. So it's kind of, and I'm guessing, I'm not a huge comic book fan, but I'm guessing that most comic books are written by men.
The vast majority, particularly at the time that Fridging was most common.
Okay.
Most were.
Okay. So when we're talking about these stories, I think what was fascinating to us is these are basically two kind of revenge fantasies, but the women don't survive. So the second story here is Promising Young Woman. That only came out in 2020.
Yeah.
And not probably many people saw it in theaters because it was 2020. But I saw it around the time that the Oscars came out because Carey Mulligan was nominated for Best Actress and Emerald Fennell was nominated for Best Director and Best Screenplay. So she wrote it and directed it. Thelma and Louise was written by Callie Corey. So it was written by a woman, but was directed by a man, Ridley Scott. This was female director and writer. And this is an interesting story because it follows Cassie, who's like a 30-year-old who hasn't really launched her life. She works in a coffee shop, but she moonlights at bars pretending to be drunk when she's not, to take men home. Well, so she can get a guy to take her home. And then when he attempts to take advantage of her, she proves that she's sober. Yeah. And she does this because her best friend in college was raped and essentially nothing happened. The school didn't do anything. And even her friends of her friend kind of didn't stand by with Nina. Nina was the friend. Cassie is the other one. And you had made the commentary, I think, that this was a story that could have gotten very violent in the beginning, that she could have taken much more harsh revenge on the sort of the everyday Joe. But she doesn't. She sort of saves that for the actual perpetrators or enablers of her friends' rape.
Yeah. Well, there was an honest trailer on YouTube that was like, this woman, she targets and deceives men, these rapists, in order to get them what they really deserve: a good talking to. It's like, so there's, but yeah. And so, anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for most moviegoers, it didn't quite work because they were like, okay, why is she just talking to them? But then when she shame on you. When she does start to get a little more into the total commitment to the revenge, is really against the perpetrators of her friends rape.
Say her friend Nina committed suicide.
Yes, that's important too. Yeah. So the primary victim of sexual assault dies, but she's already dead off screen before the movie even starts. So she starts to kind of pick these people off one by one. She doesn't kill them, but she goes after the dean by kidnapping her daughter. She goes after although with the female friend who didn't stand by Nina, she gets her drunk. And then
thinking that she slept with someone while she's drunk. Yeah.
Yeah. But she didn't actually push it that far.
Yeah. No.
And then with the lawyer who was representing the perpetrator, whose name is Alex, she ends up forgiving him because he quit his job because he couldn't sleep over what he had done.
He apologized for it. He admitted what he did was wrong. Yeah.
And then the movie climaxes where she goes to a bachelor party of the actual rapist, whose name is Alex, and he's a doctor. He looks good on the outside, and she comes dressed as a stripper, and she confronts him, and she basically tells him about what Nina was like before she was raped and what she was like after.
Yeah.
And then it looks like she's going to hurt Alex.
Yeah.
We're not sure if she's gonna kill him or just hurt him.
It looks like she's gonna carve Nina's name into him.
Oh, yeah.
And at this point, because she's gone upstairs with him and she's got him chained to the bed because she's made him think that they're going to do some kinky dom thing, and so but he's trapped essentially when she's doing this, going to attempt to do this to him. but yeah, he breaks out and ends up killing her.
I didn't, yeah, he suffocates her, and I couldn't actually watch that part because they actually like show it for a while. I mean, I started to, but it was for a long time. I was like, oh, I can't keep watching because it's but she dies, but she's able to so how does she exact revenge? She goes in kind of knowing that she might
she will say, I mean, we'll leave some of this vague, but she does find a way to get it to the police and get that this has gone on, that he was raped, and that she will probably get killed, and so she is able to get justice and get these people brought to justice through the police, through a kind of a clever way of getting evidence to the right person at the right time. So that justice is done. And again, the movie ends with the police gathering everybody up, but also finding the body of Cassie, the protagonist of the story. And, of course, they show at the end, Cassie, they find her body, and she's still got the necklace, like of Nina's necklace. It's like, she's joined with Nina in death, and their friendship, and kind of, validated Nina, in history.
Yeah. So would you say that Cassie is aiming with the way that she tries to kind of get revenge from beyond the grave, is also trying to stick it to the patriarchy, or is it something different?
Yes, I mean it is sticking to it's interesting because it's not okay. So there's a lot of interesting aspects of this that they'll take layers. It's sticking to the patriarchy in a softer sense, because it's still the police that come in to so you could see the corruption of the patriarchy, the way of men getting away with abusing women, and getting to, because like you said, he's a doctor, like he gets to go on as if nothing ever happened. He ended someone else's life as it was, but he gets to be okay afterwards. And that's sort of where feminist sort of critique of society is, that men get to do bad things and get to go on and be fine, whereas the victims, which are primarily women, get their lives shattered. And so that element of the patriarchy gets undone, but it gets undone by women utilizing the patriarchy to do it. So it's not quite as a total condemnation of the patriarchy. However, the thing to note about this is that, that wasn't the original ending of the movie. The original ending of the movie was going to be a completely sad ending. They weren't going to get justice. She was going to, be attempting to get the, get justice at the guy, but then he was going to murder her, and she was going to just be murdered. Like that was, and the patriarchy was going to win. So it was going to be just a pure tragedy, that like, this is what happens. Like the patriarchy is so evil and so powerful, and that it consumes and destroys, everything, and it just gets to get away with it. So it's more of a condemnation of the patriarchy and the way the world we live in today than a revenge fantasy, for the most part. But the problem is, producers saw it and said, nobody will go see this movie. It's too much of a downer. And so it's hard to, but it's interesting that the writer of the movie said, even though it was like, we changed the ending so that people could feel a bit more satisfied, but also, there was no way, there's no scenario in which Cassie was going to get to have a happy ending. Like, she couldn't, that was not in the cards for her. So, I mean, just pure full disclosure, I felt like the ending was false, just felt false with the whole, like, oh, we found a clever way to make it happy. I would have preferred them go to the original ending and just have it be a pure tragedy, but that's just a me thing. But I just want to make that point, just because when we're thinking about what are they trying to say, that's what she was trying to say was look how awful the patriarchy is. There's no justice here originally. And they added we're using the patriarchy in order to stop the patriarchy's abuses, was something they added in to satisfy producers.
Okay. Yeah. So it was making a different point originally than we ended up with, because they wanted to have people come and see it, because it was too much of a downer. So speaking of people not coming to see a movie, you saw Last Night in Soho, which also I think deals with this topic.
Yeah.
You said, right, that she dies. Is it similar in that she just dies tragically, or is she trying to stick it to the man?
Well, she is trying to stick it to the man, so it's interesting. I'll try not to spend too long summarizing.
Yeah, this is a quick one. Yeah.
But it's about the story. This one is directed and co-written by a man, Edgar Wright, but it is about a young girl who goes to England in order to study fashion, and she ends up in her dreams seeing the life and experiencing the life of somebody who lived in her same apartment she was in back in the 60s, and the life she lived, and this woman, and turns out she was trying to make it as an actress and a singer back in the 60s, but essentially because the patriarchy was so pervasive, she essentially had to submit to prostitution in order to get where she wanted to go in life, and she didn't even really get it anyway. And so what you think is going on, it's in the story, is that she actually gets murdered by someone in the and so then the girl is saying, okay, I've got to solve this lady's murder that occurred 6 years, all this time ago, but because there was justice was never done. What it turns out is that this woman had actually been murdering the men who were taking advantage of her all this time, and she hadn't actually been killed. She's still alive and actually was renting the apartment for this girl. But because the new protagonist girl finds out about it, she tries to kill the girl, and so the girl has to kill her in order to survive. And it's a very bad ending for the movie in so many ways, because because she forgives her, but she also she has to but the woman has to die in order to find peace. She has to die in order to find peace. And so what was funny to me is we had already been having this conversation, and I was like, and this was the next movie that dealt with sort of the casting couch and MeToo kind of sexual assault sort of things that I'd seen. And it's, again, the woman who's been sexually assaulted, she cannot find peace except in death.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's kind of gets into to the deeper discussion is the why question. Said these are Last Night in Soho isn't, but the other two were written by women, but they can't fantasize something like this happening where there's a happy ending for these characters.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, again, I haven't, full disclosure, I haven't watched every movie or even the majority of movies that deal with sexual assault, or even ones done by women, because I don't hate myself. Me too. Yeah. So yeah, hashtag me too. Sorry. So all of this will have to be taken with a grain of salt in terms of making larger statements about the movies that deal with this. But I think the only other movie I've really seen that's been big that I've seen is the Girl with Dragon Tattoo, which kind of deals with some of this. And this, the protagonist doesn't die at the end. She does, she murders the person who, and humiliates and kind of does to the person who does. So she gets revenge. It's more traditional, but I think that was done by male authors anyway. So it's kind of, so that's another thing. But but yeah. So I think that it's interesting that the big movies, let's say the big movies that most people know about, that have been celebrated by the Academy, both times. You have Thelma and Louise and Promising Young Woman, and then now again you have with Last Night in Soho. It's at this point it's becoming a trope, sort of the woman who's been sexually assaulted who dies at the end. And you're right, it's primarily being driven by women who are writing about sexual assaults. These aren't, again, men dismissing, saying we're, doing a sort of artistic stoning of the unclean woman. It's oh, she's been sexually assaulted, she has to die. No, it's women who are writing about this phenomenon of again, it's Promising a Woman, she does it twice. Because she has the girl who's first sexually assaulted, and then she has the girl who's trying to get justice. Both of them die. And in her words, again, as a writer, she's saying there was no scenario where Cassie could have a happy ending. She could not, that was something as an artist she was firm about. And so that's fascinating. And you kind of have to explore, because as you point out, most people, when they are writing their, revenge fantasies, they make it a fantasy. Like, most nerds who grew up not getting the girl in high school ended up writing Spider-Man. Like, they ended up writing, power fantasies where they get to be stronger than the jock, beat up the jock and then get the girl. Like, I mean, that's what you do when you're trying to tell a story that's repairing an aspect of that's traumatic for you, for the most part. I mean, obviously, but particularly because these stories, again, like Thelma and Louise, A Promising Young Woman, and then, to a lesser extent, Last Night in Soho, writing these stories, they're attempting to be sort of feminist celebrations and kind of like these and they're celebrated in that way as these and so you kind of have to ask, why did you choose to write it this way? Like, you could have written it any way. You could have written, the sort of, you take the Christian motif, creation, fall, redemption, restoration. You could have written a story that was redemptive of the situation, and you chose not to. And you have to you have to ask why that is that you don't do that. And again, like I say, not a non-expert. I can just sort of have my thoughts on this, but I would say, what I know we've sort of talked about this and some of our theories about it, but I think I would like to throw it to you first. Like, what is it that it says to you as, as a woman who has actually had this happen to her and who has done research on this? What is it that when you first watched these and experienced them and wrestle with them, why is it that you felt like they were doing it? And as you've done research and kind of like, it's like, why does it seem like they were doing it to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my initial thought when it happened again in Promising Young Woman, I was like, oh, this is the same thing. It's feminist lore, but they're not surviving. I think it struck me when I saw it as the power of the patriarchy of this is the feeling of powerlessness that they have is so strong that in order to feel empowered, they have to die because there was no way that they were going to survive in the patriarchy afterward. With doing additional research, I think that the way that I see it now is that when Thelma in Thelma and Louise is the one who was she's assaulted. He doesn't go all the way through with it. Something in her snaps at that point, and something in Louise snaps at that point too, because it's having her have a flashback, which is she literally gets triggered in that situation. She actually pulls a trigger because she's feeling so close to what happened to her. So they're trying to fight back at first, right? So Thelma and Louise are trying to fight back at first. Nina, we're not sure. She at least tries to get some justice through the school. It doesn't happen. She ends up killing herself. Cassie's trying to make things right by somehow lecturing these guys that try to take her home. So they're trying to fight back in the way that they can, but something inside of them in their brain chemistry has switched off. So they're in fight flight mode, which is like a mode that you can go into. And I think that what happens is they're not fleeing as much as they're fighting. You see these women fighting. So that's why it becomes feministic. But eventually they realize that what's happened to them is violence against them, and acting out that violence in other ways is not helping. So they act out the violence against themselves, or they put themselves in dangerous situations like Cassie, where the violence happens because it's there. It's like this ever-present thing, even though they flip into this mode where it looks like they're just fighting back. That's my theory.
So that makes sense to me. I think so. Again, listening to feminists talk and sort of listening to feminist literature, and even non-feminists, but women who've been trying to get justice, sort of against not just sexual assault, but different ways that they feel like men and sort of the patriarchy, the system sort of men of is sort of inoculated against that. There is a sense of hopelessness that you sort of see that not always, but there is this, one of the things I think is interesting, like with the you look at the MeToo movement, is seeing how sort of women's experiences and responses to that, because they call out and say, hey, look at all this rampant sexual assault that's going on. And then they think, okay, there's a movement now, we can fix things. And then over the past years, you watch as the things they've tried to implement to fix things have not worked for the most part, at least not to the degree that they wanted them to. Like, again, I think the degree to which consciousness has been raised is like I always joke, like, I love the show How I Met Your Mother, but like, you couldn't have a character like Barney Stinson today, because the fact that he legitimately lies in order to sleep with women, deceives them, is like, people are like, okay, this is not okay behavior. So consciousness has been raised to a degree, but like, the Time's Up organization that they started, the many women in Hollywood started to give resources to women who are dealing with sexual assault, or bosses who are being a sexist or stuff like that. That organization is almost in collapse right now, because the women at the top have been collaborating with sexual assaulters. I mean, one of them was actually helping the PR campaign of Governor Cuomo in New York. I mean, it's just like, the thing is, it keeps happening. Like, they'll get rid of one woman at the top, and then the next person they have in charge will do the same thing. And so that organization is kind of in collapse. And then you have the sort of women in the workplace problem, where like they're trying to get sexual harassment policies taking place in place area. But what's happened then is men have stopped taking like private meetings with women, because they realize that if something does happen where they're accused falsely, they're going to have no way to fight back. And again, that's very rare, but it happens enough that every guy at least has a friend who has a story about something like that happening. So it doesn't happen a lot, but it happens enough that men are like, I can't take a chance. And so what that's done is, and there's a lot of news stories about this, you can talk to this sort of feminists have this crisis where it's like, the stuff we've been doing to protect us from sexual assault is actually strengthening the patriarchy. And so all that to say, this kind of hopelessness of like, you have this first outrage at the thing that's been happened to you. But then you gradually get this hopelessness against actually getting anything accomplished, any justice done. The patriarchy is just too powerful and so the only way to have any dignity in the situation is again, like you ride off a cliff. It's like, because again, the choice is the patriarchy takes you back to oppress you, and then you either are a prisoner or you participate in the system, become a participant in the system, or you die. And again, in case of Cassie, it's like, you can, and this again, in the original ending, it was even more stark. She tries to get justice, but the combination of he's just stronger than her. So it's like, the male upper body strength and testosterone. So he's able to combine. And then his friend who's willing to stick by him and help him cover it up. So, testosterone and fraternity, like those two things are too strong to get any justice from them. And so the only thing you can do is you can fight against it and then die in the attempt. And again, if you want to look at the second ending, the ending that we got, okay, if that's what it takes to get justice is for a woman to sacrifice herself to get it. And then even then, what happens? Well, the patriarchy stops the patriarchy, but the patriarchy is still in place. Like, that doesn't change. So I think that narratively, that makes sense. That's sort of that, because that's the only thing that can overcome that the only priority that artists have over fantasy is authenticity. And I think that for many of these women, it doesn't feel emotionally authentic to have a fantasy of getting what they want and getting justice, because it doesn't match the reality. It doesn't match the reality of what they feel and what they experience. of course, the irony is that these women got to, at least Promising Woman got to write and direct this movie. So that to a certain degree, they have made it. So it's like, I mean, how powerful, like how much has the patriarchy just been, unassailable and unbeatable by women? If you guys, and then win the Oscar, at the Academy Awards for the movie. So you can, there's different ways you can look at it. But the internal aspect, I think, is really interesting. So this is something you point out to me, and I'm bringing this up because I want to sort of turn it in this direction a little bit, because you point this out, is talking about, you were hearing interviews of people who spoke out in the Me Too movement about, their experiences, and the way that they talk about the experiences. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, about the research you've done that in terms of the experience and psychology of that.
So I grabbed this book. It's called Catch and Kill. It sort of tells the origins of the Me Too story, Me Too movement through Ronan Farrow. I'm not going to jump into it. This is one of the books I've been reading for research because I wanted to know what happened to the real women who kind of were at the forefront. It's not pretty. Like Rose McGowan lost her house. They all have eating disorders. Like they were under crazy NDAs where they couldn't even talk to their therapist. So like it sort of proved my sadness and my theory here. It was like, they're not dead, but they're broken. They're really broken. Like it doesn't look like heroines here. It looks like people who ended up homeless or with eating disorders or suicidal or having to move to different countries. Like it's sad. So yeah, I was, and even I watched a Megyn Kelly response to the movie that they made about her, which was Bombshell, which they don't die at the end of that one. And they actually do get some level of justice, but she watched it with 4 other women who actually went through it for real.
Yeah.
And you could just sense like Megyn, probably because she has a solid husband and a good marriage and she still has a career, even if it doesn't look like it did 4 or 5 years ago. She's probably the closest to being okay, but the rest of them, you could just see like either really bitter or really, really devastated by this thing that had happened maybe 14, 15 years ago. Because for most of those women, it destroyed their careers. Like if they stood up to the patriarchy, it did destroy their careers. So that's one part of it.
I was just looking up right now, like who wrote, okay, so it's an interesting thing, that Bombshell was directed and written by men. No women were, it's written, directed by Jay Roach and written by Charles Randolph. So so that's interesting. The most positive, optimistic movie being made sort of about Me Too situation is made by men. I think I'll say this has been interesting. I'm really interested in 2 movies that are coming out this year. I think it's Hello, Darling. I think it's the one that's Olivia Wilde is doing, directing with Florence Pugh and Harry Styles, and then also She Said, which is the movie of like the women who broke the story of Harvey Weinstein. So both of those movies are coming out this year. I'm interested in seeing how they deal with it and if they're at all, because like how I deal with that. But regardless, it's like a picture like the women who have gone through this. What you're describing to me, they are heroically defiant. I mean, like this really did. They seem very shattered and like broken people in many ways who still have not recovered or healed. Even in the way, and not something like even the way that you experience that you have. It's like a lot of things are getting better in some ways, but people psychologically who this has happened to do not seem, at least the ones at the forefront of the Me Too movement, and all the previous abuses in Hollywood and things like that have not been getting better in a tangible way, or at least still retain that shattered picture. And so that does make sense of why we're seeing movies now that women are getting to start to tell their own stories in this way, that reflect that. I would be interested in seeing, like, in a few years, like, go by, because like you said, they were into these crazy NDAs, so they couldn't like even talk about it with people. And so like, if they still are that way in a few years, it would be interesting. But I do want to just like, let's give context, because again, a lot of people watching this are going to be fans of you and fans of your show and have heard you talk about things before. But I would like to say, okay, you see, at the very least, like let's say the primary female artists and creatives of our generation who are and the previous one, you know, because this was, you know, the Thelma and Louise. So like it would seem that they haven't given us a way for women to really overcome this trauma, because they haven't really experienced that themselves. Like I can say that's a fair, I think that's a fair assessment. But what were some of the things that helped you get to the place where you can, again, you can say, I experienced what I consider to be full healing?
Yeah, it did take some anxiety medication. I am not, but I consider, so this is tricky because I think in some situations, if you need the medication on long-term, take it. But I was able to come off it within a year of going on anxiety medication. Paxil, I think, was the main one. And then there was one that I took if I did have a panic attack. So then that's common. They give you one that kind of like calms you generally, and then one if you're having a panic attack. But I think I consider myself fully healed because the reason that I was on that is no longer there, because the trauma was able to kind of come out. So I was in a group therapy through church. I was in individual therapy. And I think that the point of those two things was to, one, know that you're not alone, and two, both of those were Christian. And so the scripture that I was thinking about is Isaiah 53, where it talks about Jesus suffering for us and by his stripes we're healed. So there is this sense for me in my story that it was not around the suffering, but it was kind of confronting how bad it was. And essentially, you know, on the patriarchy, the justice side, even though I felt like I didn't get the justice that I wanted to, there was a sense that for me in my story, that it was like I stood up in the way that I needed to. And ultimately, it wasn't my job to exact revenge. I think so. Forgiveness was a big piece of it. Being able to forgive people that I thought had let me down, but also my attackers. And that I think can only come through God, but also facing how evil it is and how much it affected me was also something that I think I could only get through with God. So it's not just like I became a Christian and it was all better because I was a Christian before and I was a Christian during and I was a Christian after.
But in your experience, your faith and the practices, beliefs and practices of your faith gave you resources for getting through it since you had it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so
it was faith, therapy, and medication, but I think without the faith aspect of it, I would probably still be on medication. But because with faith, I was able to sort of like, you know, put it is in long term, but also just to know that there is somebody that I can give this to. Right. I think that's the biggest part of faith, is there's somebody that you can give it to. Well, whereas you don't have faith and you own it for the rest of your life.
Yes. Well, I mean, and correct me if you think this is at all wrong, but what Sword says to me, I think is interesting, is that you were able to put it in the context of a story that was that you could live with, because you know, and this is sort of a pithy thing that Christians say. Doesn't make it not true though, which is that you talked about like you could put the pain somewhere, but it's like you could also put your desire for justice somewhere, where it's like, you know, the fact that justice in the way that you thought it should be wasn't done didn't mean that justice wouldn't be done, because you had faith in God that they would be able to do that, and able to and you had a built-in community. And again, you can't overstate the fact you had people you could talk to about it, and you had a community that could come around you. I
wasn't under an NDA.
We're not under an NDA. That's why I think I'd be interested in seeing what the changes, when these NDAs have gone away and things like that. I'd be interested in seeing what component is that. But again, you were able to have God in your life gave you a story you could tell about it, which is it. And I'm getting this because you've told me about this, and I think that's really fascinating to me. I will say something. This is a component that we haven't brought. You might have already thought of. We haven't brought up in our conversations yet. And it just struck me because I was thinking about, like, are there any other movies and shows that deal with sexual assault that are come out recently that have had a different picture of it? And I realized that there is an example of a person dealing with trauma of sexual assault where restoration is a part of it. It's really interesting, given your story, the connection to your story, because it's The Chosen. The story,
yes.
Chosen, is one of the highest profile shows right now that is dealing explicitly with a woman's PTSD around sexual assault that is built around the restoration of her and the healing of her through that process. And of course, because The Chosen does weird time jumps sometimes, and they show us the future, we know that Mary Magdalene is not going to die because they've already shown us her in the future, like, later. And so flash forward. There it is. Yes. I'll say not the only thing, but one of the big factors at play that differentiates your story from the story of the cultural storytellers and myth makers today that are dealing with this is the beliefs and practices of your faith. And it's interesting to say that the stories now that are dealing with that show restoration that can happen are people of faith. We're telling now, granted, these are also men mostly who are writing this. I think this is worth investigating, the ways that does faith give you a better shot at being able to have a more holistic healing process of it just by looking at the testimonies of people of faith who have come through this versus the storytellers and the testimonies of secular people who have gone through this. I'm wondering, it's a fascinating thing just to see the script of the cultural storytellers that the women who have gone through this are telling to other women is not, here's a path forward. That's like, they're not telling them. I mean, again, wouldn't you want to, again, this is get on a soapbox here, this is something, but if something horrible like this happened to you, like, wouldn't you want to tell other people who've gone through this is the way forward, how to make your way forward? Because, like, I've gone through this is what I've learned, here's how you can go forward. Wouldn't you want to do that? And they're not doing that. They're not giving them a vision for the future, and the only justifiable reason for them to do that is they don't have one.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's what I've realized too, is in the research, and especially with women like Megyn Kelly or Rose McGowan, where it's like, you are real, you are on TV all the time talking about this. Megyn, not so much, but Rose for sure. And I'm like, you don't have a way forward with this.
Yeah.
And hers happened in the 90s. Yeah. Right. So knowing for me that there is a way forward and being able to sort of explore what that looks like fictionally, but then adding some research to it, it's wonderful, really, because I know that I'm not, that I'm not unique. And I've, there's, this is interesting in being more public with this recent, really the podcast started it off, because this happened to me 10, 11 years ago. But being more public, I've shared testimonies before, Christians share testimonies. I have never, ever had anything so tit for tat, where it's every time I tell this story, I see immediate fruit of it.
Wow.
So even with, I just wrote an article for a women's magazine, like one close friend of mine was like, everything you said, I resonate with.
Wow.
And so it's just whatever you saw when you were suggested the movie, and now as I'm kind of going into it, I'm like, oh my goodness, feels like bringing water to a desert.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to see if there's water outside of faith-based ways to heal. I think that there's some balms. I don't know if there's healing. But so I'm willing to kind of do this because it's hard. Right. And to wrestle with the idea.
I can't imagine why it would be hard.
To be the person to kind of be more associated with this event in my life, because I'm realizing that there's few people who are able to tell a story in a way that say, here's a way forward. So if I can be that person that says there is a way forward, and there's other than that, there's silence, I guess I'm willing to do that. So that's part of the reason why why I'm doing this. And I think that it would be interesting to see if faith-based methods or adding that God component helps. One side note that I'll make is, and I include this in the story, in the fictional story too, because I think it's an important aspect. When I was in Christian group therapy, there was some women there who had been divorced from their Christian husbands for 20 years and still felt like they were in the same amount of pain. And they had been through different, Christian ways to heal too, or Christian ways to deal with their past, and they were still stuck. So it's not, so there's something else too than just like, oh, Jesus will fix it.
Right. And this is important to say, like, and there's also a lot of, within many faith-based communities, an allergy to the therapy methodology and to medication, things like that many, people who have mental illness, like, or have had trauma that I've talked to. Had one person on a podcast, Overthinkers Podcast recently, Zohori Zapata, who talked about, the sort of the stigma against therapy in some of these faith-based communities, and that causes real damage for faith-based communities to say don't go to therapy, like he's kind of scared of it and feel like, oh, if you just got demons, you just got to have Jesus pray for demons. And of course, I guess it's not like just a Christian thing. Again, it tends to be like I have coworkers, from Nigeria and places like that, where they're like, if it's in rural communities, it's like it's voodoo. That's your problem. There's a kind of rural thing that happens where it's like that you can't go to therapy or to do or take medication for this problem, like mental trauma doesn't exist and things like that. So there are those things. So it's like we're not saying that you just need Jesus, or that you do, or even again, if you just have all the cocktail of things that you need, it will always work. I said Tim Keller did a sermon one time where he talked about, look, just like people are mind, body, spirit, they and so you can have a chemical imbalance in the brain, and for that you may need a chemical solution. You can have trauma and things like that, and you might then need, therapy to help you talk through this. And you could have spiritual problems, and in that case, you need prayer and things like that. And because people are complex, and so we're not saying like, look at these secular people, that they don't have the real solution that we have, and like that. And I wouldn't even say that I am saying giving any definitive answers on these things at all. What I do think is interesting is you have a whole bunch of storytellers who've been given the green light to tell people, here's finally, like women are saying, this is what happened to me, and this is the sense I've been able to make of it. And so far, the sense they've been able to make of it as there's only release and death, and there's a reason for that. And it's weird that there is another story out there for people who have not felt that way, and those stories are not getting told for some reason. And it's a story that is fascinating because it's a story you went through, because you have that story, and that story needs to be told because people who've gone through this need to know that there is a path forward beyond death and despair that's not getting told, and it's got to be told by somebody. And faith is a component of it, and that's a part of it that's interesting to us because we're people of faith, but also because it does seem to be one of the things that's different. But regardless, it's a story that needs to be told. And I think that's why I think it's like a really interesting aspect of your, and also to points, every time you talk about it with somebody, like they say, yes, this resonates with me. And so that's why I think it is incredibly exciting to And I've been, supporting as much as I've been able to help to you getting to do this, and because I think it's an important, and I hope I'd like to see people, I mean, can you imagine? I'm sorry, but like that, there are like thousands, maybe millions. I don't know what the rate is for, but of women who this has happened to, millions of women this has happened to, and they don't have a story that tells them you can get out of it and you can be restored. Mm-hmm. That's in like no movie that shows the path. I mean, I'm sure there are some movies, but for the most part, they don't get movies that tell them. Again, it was like we have 100 movies a year that are about, here, if you were nerdy in high school, here's how you can be restored. And we don't have, we scarcely find a movie that's about like, hey, you've been assaulted, here's how you can be restored. And we need those stories.
Yeah. I think we've talked a lot about really like the no hope way that we've seen storytellers give. My story, and the story that I'm trying and wrestling to tell is a story of hope, and realizing that maybe there is some limitation if it's one story, is it true for everybody? But right. Having told my story more now and realizing it does resonate with so many people, I do think that what I'm trying to do this story, you're trying to help me get it out there, it is like bringing water to the desert. Yeah. And I think a lot of people are going to be refreshed by it. And not because we're preaching, but because we're actually wrestling and trying to search for truth, which I would say that these screenwriters and these movie makers with these other movies are trying to do too. They just haven't been able to find the hope in the truth so far. But hopeful stories. And if you have a hopeful story, please comment below, because I want to hear your way forward of what worked. But Joseph, thank you so much for joining me and giving me so much of your time for this really interesting discussion that's hard on the movie side and hard on the church side, because it's not a topic that's often dealt with at all, or dealt with in a way that's hopeful.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I've loved getting to be a part of this journey for you and exploring this, and loving getting to do it on camera. So I'm very the pleasure and the honor is mine.
All right. Talk to you guys soon. Thank you.
Ciao, baby.